recording for Chapter 9, Strategy Formulation. Chapters 6, 7, and 8 looked at strategies at 3 different levels for the organization. In Chapter 6, we talked about strategy at the corporate or firm level, growth, stability, or retrenchment. Chapter 7, we talked about business strategies, competitive strategies, and we emphasized the typology that Porter proposed with low-cost differentiation and focus. In Chapter 8, we talked about functional strategies and emphasized how those strategies tend to align with business strategies in the organization. Now that we've described those strategies, we want to turn our attention to thinking about how the organization can change strategies or maybe adopt a different strategic position going forward. So in Chapter 9, Strategy Formulation, we look at the information that we've gleaned in the previous chapters in terms of the current organization strategies. We blend that with some of the earlier research that we've done externally in terms of industry structure and the macro environment, and we start pulling it together in a way that lets us look forward and think about the types of strategic direction our company should be taking. So what are the key issues in Chapter 9? We talk about the fundamentals of the SWOT analysis. The SWOT is our primary tool, and if done correctly, can really help an organization make sense of the strategic options available. We talk about resources, human, organization, and physical resources. And we talk about the SWOT matrix. The SWOT matrix is an extension of the SWOT analysis, and this is a tool that really helps us identify alternatives for strategic decisions. We then introduce the SCLC matrix to help evaluate those alternatives, and we close the chapter with a discussion of issues in strategy formulation. So let's start with the SWOT. Perhaps you've seen a SWOT before in other classes. You may have seen one online or even worked with one in your organization. The SWOT is a useful tool in lots of scenarios, but there are certain ways that you want to execute it properly. So if you think you understand the SWOT, it's a very basic tool, you still want to pay attention to some of these points as we go through this audio commentary. Now, there are 2 parts to the SWOT. There's an internal piece and an external piece. The strengths and weaknesses represent the internal characteristics, the positive and negative characteristics, and the opportunities and threats are outside the firm. Now, the purpose of the SWOT is to organize research and perspectives into a useful framework for strategic decision making. The SWOT is not about creating information. The SWOT is about organizing information or research that you already have. And this is a mistake that's often made in strategic analysis or in misapplications of the SWOT. If you start the process with a SWOT, then you are skipping the type of research and previous analysis that's necessary to make sure you understand your organization and the environment properly. So again, nothing new is created with the SWOT. It's just organized in a way that makes sense. Now let's look at the strengths and weaknesses, the internal piece of the SWOT analysis. Now let's look at a few concepts that can help us understand how to approach these strengths and weaknesses. Now, gap analysis identifies the distance between a firm's current position and its desired position. Now, the notion of gap analysis is that we should see where we are, look at benchmarks or industry averages or maybe even a rival in the industry that's doing well, and we should shore up that gap. We should take action to improve our performance. Now, so far as that goes, that seems to make sense. But keep in mind, there might be situations where a gap would exist and you don't want to take corrective action. If you recall from the audio commentary for the previous chapter, we talked about the concept of inventory turnover, and we said that you might have a business that has a worse inventory turnover rate than the industry has as an average, but you might not want to take any action to improve that. The reason being is that you might be the store known for having all the products that consumers need. Even if they're at higher prices, you have a great selection of products. So you could certainly improve your inventory turnover by dropping the low sellers from your product line, but then you might not attract many of the customers who might pick up 1 or 2 of those items and put them in the basket with everything else they shop for that week. So gap analysis helps us identify the gaps between where we are and where we'd like to be, and we might want to take action, but it doesn't necessarily mean we will take action to shore up those gaps. The value chain is an interesting tool, and it helps a firm analyze strengths and weaknesses and understand how they might translate into competitive advantage or disadvantage. And the point behind the value chain is to look at the different processes that occur in terms of creating or producing a product or service. And you want to identify anything along the way that doesn't add value, and you want to emphasize areas that do add value. Another concept we talk about is that of strategic capabilities. Having a resource itself is not a strength or weakness. The resource has to be translated into a strategic capability to be valuable. And you might think of the old adage or maybe comments that were made when you were growing up where your parents told you, hey, you're really a smart kid, but you don't apply yourself. That's a way of saying that you have a resource, but you don't have a capability. You have to put that resource into action. And the same is true with companies. Companies often have creative people. They have production processes that can be used in very interesting ways. But if you don't apply those resources, you don't get the value. So here we want to emphasize leveraging our resources and obtaining value. Now, there are different sources of organizational strengths and weaknesses, and we can divide these into three categories. We can think in terms of people or human resources, organizational resources, or physical resources. Now, the human resources, the people, will focus on the experience, capabilities, knowledge, skills, and judgment of all of our employees, and that would include everyone from the board members all the way down to workers on the assembly line or in the stores or what have you. Organizational resources include the firm's systems and processes. So strategies would fall into this category, and as well as the structure and the culture. We haven't talked about structure and culture yet in detail. Those are addressed in chapters 10 and 11, but they would qualify as organizational resources. Physical resources tend to be things you can touch. Not exactly, but they tend to be. Things like the plant, the equipment, locations, access to raw materials, the distribution network, and even technology. I know you can't touch technology, but you certainly can touch the physical plants where the technology is applied. What are some issues to consider with these categories of resources? When you think of human resources, you might want to think of the tenure, experience, and present level of investment of your board members. Think about your top managers, your chief executive. What type of background or capabilities or experience does that individual bring to the table? What about other managers? Are your workers well trained and developed? Is turnover a problem? Do you have effective performance appraisal systems? So these are some of the things you might think about in terms of human resources. What about organizational resources? Well, is there a consistency across your corporate, business, and functional strategies? Again, consistency was a theme of the previous chapter. The idea that specifically your business strategy should be aligned with your functional strategy, so everyone's moving in the same direction. Is there a consistency between your organizational strategies and your firm's mission and goals? What about consistencies between strategy and structure, and consistencies between strategies and culture? Again, these are concepts discussed in the next two chapters in more detail. What about the relative position in the industry? Are you an industry leader? Are you a small company trying to grow? How about the quality of your product or service? And what about the reputation of the firm and the brands that you have? Now, when you think about physical resources, you can think about things like the currency of your technology, the quality and sophistication of your distribution network. How about your production capacity, or do you have access, reliable access to cost-effective sources of supplies? Do you have favorable locations? So here we have three categories of resources and a lot of issues we can consider within each category. Now we want to talk about something we call the VRINO framework, VRINO. And this is a way of thinking about how we take resources and think of and sort of convert them to capabilities, or we value these resources in a way that helps us understand how they can contribute to competitive advantage. So we can describe resources in 5 ways according to the VRINO framework. Each one builds upon the previous level. So if we start with valuable, we can say a resource is valuable if it can be employed to exploit an opportunity or neutralize a threat. Now, if there's only value is great, but there's only value, then there's only parity with rivals. You've only gotten to the level where your rivals are. This is nothing stupendous, but it's a start, we can say. The next qualification, or the next quality of a resource that builds on value is rarity. So we would say, if we say that a resource is rare, then it's valuable plus it's rare. Here you have a resource that's controlled by one or a few entities. In other words, this resource is something your company has, but not all companies have it. At this point, you can often apply this resource and develop competitive advantage. It might only be temporary, but it certainly is a little bit stronger than having just a valuable resource. The next level is inimitable. In other words, can this resource be imitated easily by your rivals? Is it costly for rivals to duplicate? So if you're able to do something that creates competitive advantage and your competitors can't duplicate it, or at least can't do so in a cost-effective manner, then you have potential for long-term competitive advantage. The next characteristic on the ladder is non-substitutable. Okay, the question here is, are substitutes for the resources readily available? If they are, then your rivals will likely use those. Now, if you have valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable resources, then the firm has a strong potential for long-term competitive advantage. You really have something here when you start having non-substitutable resources. But the highest quality, or the highest level of resources, is what we call organization. And here the firm possesses the appropriate capabilities to leverage the resource. At this point, it's not just about resources, it's about capabilities to put them together in sometimes a very sophisticated manner. And in this way, you can often do something as an organization that your competitors simply can't match. You think about a couple of companies that have been able to move all the way to the top. Amazon's a good example. It does so many things in terms of keeping costs down and partnerships with other companies, be it delivery, be it smaller businesses that are able to sell their products on Amazon. It maintains an excellent customer database. There's so many things, so many resources involved in Amazon's success, and Amazon has developed the capabilities to piece those resources together in a way that is almost unmatched, or it's almost impossible to match by a competitor. So it's so valuable to Amazon. Think about Apple as well. Apple produces iPhones and computers. Apple has a cult following of customers who really like those products, like the Mac products, like the iPhone products. And Apple has put together a very competitive group of human resource professionals, a lot of innovation going on in the company, and they've been able to produce the types of products and services that, even though they get challenged by competitors, they're always able to fend them off. So Amazon and Apple are two examples of companies that have taken their resources all the way up to the organization level, where they're able to utilize the appropriate capabilities to piece them together in ways that just can't be matched readily by competitors. Now let's talk about the opportunities and threats piece, or the external piece of the SWOT analysis. Now the strengths and weaknesses are internal, the opportunities and threats are external. So if something comes from outside the organization, it cannot be a strength or weakness. It's got to be an opportunity or threat. All opportunities and threats must come from one of two places. Either the analysis of the external environment or macro environmental forces, which would be your pest analysis, or the application of the industry analysis, which is Porter's 5 force model. Remember, these were covered back in chapters 2, 3, and 4. So if you're looking at any type of opportunities or threats in the SWOT, and they were not introduced or developed in these previous sections, then either they should be, you should go back and correct that, or you might not be looking at opportunities and threats. Perhaps you're looking at a strength or weakness and misapplying it. So make sure that all of your opportunities and threats are grounded in those earlier sections. Now, there are a couple of pitfalls you want to avoid when you categorize opportunities and threats. And this is where if you're kind of dozing off because you've done SWOT analysis before and you think everything is typical, this is where I want to wake you up here, because often if you look at SWOT analysis, analyses that are done and posted online or maybe even applied in companies, they make these mistakes. So make sure that you think about them so you don't make the same mistakes. Don't confuse external opportunities with internal strengths and weaknesses. Doing something well is not an opportunity. It's something that you're already doing. Implementing a strategy that you're already implementing is not an opportunity. It's something that already exists as a strength or a weakness for the company if it's not being done well. Internal factors are strengths or weaknesses. Don't mislabel them as opportunities or threats for that matter. Now, the second pitfall is probably the greatest pitfall, and this mistake is made in most SWOT analyses that you'll see online. And this is a confusion between opportunities and alternatives. These words are interchanged in everyday speech. We talk about opportunities to go to college or to do this or do that. So we think about opportunities as being courses of action. But in the context of a SWOT analysis, they're not. Opportunities exist outside the organization, and if they're acted on, they can potentially provide a positive outcome. But the opportunity itself is not the action. The action would be an alternative, and we get to that later. That comes out of the SWOT matrix. So if you have an opportunity and you're talking about an opportunity to do something, it has been mislabeled. It is not an opportunity in the context of the SWOT analysis. Now, we'll talk about an example in a few slides, and I think some of this will become clear, but you want to keep these pitfalls in mind, especially number 2. It's a very common error. This brings us to steps 16 through 19 of the SWOT analysis. In 16, 17, 18, 19, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, this is where you list the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for your company. Now, keep in mind the strengths and weaknesses come from the analysis of the firm's resources, and the opportunities and threats must be rooted in the earlier external environment or industry analyses. Be sure not to confuse the internal and external factors. That's the first pitfall. And especially do not confuse the opportunities with alternatives. Remember, opportunities are external factors that are applied to the firm. Sometimes they sound like restatements of issues that were addressed earlier. In many respects, they are, because keep in mind, when we do the pest analysis and we do industry structure, we talk about how different factors affect an entire industry. At the SWOT analysis level, we talk about how those factors affect the firm. So it might sound like you're repeating it, except you're applying it to the company. But the main point here is the opportunity or the threat. The opportunities and threats are external to the company, external to your organization. They're not actions that can be taken. Now, the step that we apply after the SWOT analysis is called the SWOT matrix. And this utilizes the SWOT analysis to develop strategic alternatives. And the point here is you're looking at combinations of internal and external factors and trying to brainstorm and come up with ideas of things your company might do. This is where that creativity we talked about in Chapter 1, the arts perspective on strategy, comes back into play. So you can combine, and you can think about this in terms of combining strengths, weaknesses with opportunities and threats in 4 ways. Now, these are broad categories. It's not like you need to develop an alternative from each category, but just a way of thinking about alternatives. So if you combine a strength with an opportunity, you have what we call an offensive alternative. The point here is that you're utilizing a strength to address an opportunity that exists in the environment. Always offensive. Alternatively, you could take a weakness connected with a threat, and that might suggest a course of action that's defensive. And here you're trying to take action to eliminate or minimize a weakness in order to minimize or mitigate the effect of a threat. Now, you can also combine a strength and a threat, where you utilize a strength to minimize the effect of a threat, and you can also combine a weakness and opportunity. And here you shore up a weakness in order for your firm to take advantage of an opportunity. Now, the strength-threat combinations and the weakness-opportunity combinations can be either offensive or defensive. Again, these are categories to help us think about alternatives. It's not that you try to come up with alternatives that fit in each particular category. Now let's look at an example that might help us put this into practice and understand what we're talking about. Here's a hypothetical example for McDonald's. Now let's assume going into this example that we've done all the analysis up to this stage so that the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats identified in the SWOT matrix are accurate. So we don't need to debate whether they're accurate or correct. We just assume they are for the sake of this example. And we also see that there are only 2 or 3 in each category. Any type of detailed, sophisticated analysis will have more than 2 or 3 in each category, but we're going to limit our discussion here just to illustrate how the SWOT matrix works. So in this particular example, what we've done with McDonald's, we've identified 3 strengths. Number 1, McDonald's has a lot of financial stability and resources. Number 2, it has a very strong brand name, very strong brand recognition. And number 3, has consistency in its operations. But McDonald's also has 2 weaknesses. Reputation for bland tasting fast food. Maybe I injected some of my own opinion here, but we'll take it for the sake of discussion. And number 2, the dependence on fried foods. Now, there are 2 opportunities for McDonald's here. One is the growth in emerging economies that we see throughout the world, and the other would be an increasing health consciousness in the U.S. and other markets. But there are a couple of threats we've identified as well. A global economic downturn, which could occur, and the growing popularity of easy-to-prepare items in grocery stores. Again, for the sake of argument, let's assume that the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that I just addressed are accurate and they've been properly researched up to this point. Now let's take a look at the alternatives that were created from the SWOT matrix. Well, alternative 1 combines the first 2 strengths, the financial stability and resources, and the brand name and recognition, with the first opportunity, the growth in emerging economies. And this creates an alternative for us to launch new locations in the BRIC nations. Now, the BRIC nations are Brazil, Russia, India, and China. You might say, why these 4 nations? Let's assume that the research was done to support these 4. I didn't just pull them out of the air. Another alternative would be to expand healthier food alternatives. This would be weakness 1 and 2 with opportunity 2. So here you have a company with a reputation for bland tasting fast food and a heavy dependence on fried foods, combined with the increasing health consciousness in the U.S. and other markets. Well, McDonald's could respond by expanding healthier food alternatives. And then you have alternative number 3, launch foods in grocery outlets. Here you're leveraging 2 strengths, number 2 and 3, the brand name and recognition and the consistency in operations, with the second threat, the growing popularity of easy-to-prepare items in grocery stores. So the idea here is to launch foods in grocery outlets. Now, you might look through this and say, well, McDonald's perhaps already has some items in grocery outlets. I'm not aware of those, but you do see some other fast food restaurants like Taco Bell with sauces and some other things. You might say that McDonald's products aren't amenable to the frozen food section of a grocery store. Who's going to buy chicken McNuggets and go home and microwave them? Well, you can analyze those in the next step. The idea here by creating the alternative is not to say these are things the company should do, but these are things the company realistically could do or should consider doing. Now, a couple of observations about the matrix before we move on. Number 1, you might look at, say, opportunity number 2, the increasing health consciousness, and say that that's not an opportunity, that's a threat. You could flip the coin and look at that from the other side. That could create a problem for McDonald's or a long-term negative situation for the company. I agree with that. You could list that as a threat depending on your analysis. It's okay. The main thing is that that point is brought into the analysis and it's considered either as an opportunity or as a threat. As long as it's somewhere on that part of the analysis, then it can become or feed into an alternative for consideration. Another question you might ask is how many strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats should be developed? Well, that's an interesting question to think about. There's no perfect number. Let's just say this example doesn't provide enough. And let's say that if you have 10 or 15 in each category, you probably have too many. Here's another way of thinking about it. Let's say you have 10 strengths, 10 weaknesses, 10 opportunities, and 10 threats. How many individual combinations of a strength or weakness with an opportunity or threat are possible. Well, I paused to give you a second to do the math. If you need some help, the answer would be 400, because you take 10 strengths plus 10 weaknesses, that's 20. 10 opportunities plus 10 threats is 20. 20 times 20 is 400. That means in terms of individual combinations, and that doesn't even consider complex combinations, there are 400 different options. That's a long night of brainstorming. So what you want to do is use the SWOT and use the matrix as a tool to simplify the analysis to the point that you can make good decisions. So if you can find a way to pare those down, so let's just say you have multiple strengths, 10 or 12 strengths, and you find that 2 or 3 of them might be able to break down into one broader strength. Maybe you talk about the firm having a strong public relations department and maybe strong promotional campaigns. You might want to cluster those into something we would call a strong marketing effort. And that's a way of reducing the number of strengths, and you can do that across the board to keep your SWOT matrix more manageable. Just something to think about. No perfect answer here, but something to consider going forward. Once we have our alternatives, we want to plot them in the SLSC matrix. And here you're looking at the alternatives in terms of level of strategy that is most likely affected by the alternative and the degree of strategy complexity. Now, all strategies tend to affect all levels to some extent, but we can typically plot them in a different category based on the primary influence. For example, the healthier food alternatives is predominantly a functional strategy alternative, because you would be creating new food options and introducing them in stores. And yes, there are some business and corporate considerations, but it's primarily something that's done at the functional level. And we'll say, for the sake of argument, that it probably is the least complex option, because you're developing new items using existing equipment to produce them in stores, and probably not too difficult to employ. Just because it's easier to employ than the other two strategies doesn't mean it's better. It just means it's not as complex. Now, take the launching frozen foods in grocery outlets. We'll put this one in the business and medium level. And because we're talking about putting frozen foods in grocery outlets, we'll consider this a competitive move, because we're positioning those products against those of our rivals. Now, again, this, like the first alternative, this has some corporate and functional characteristics, but we think that it fits primarily in the business category. Now, this particular alternative, we might say, has medium strategic strategy complexity. It's a little bit more difficult in developing a new sandwich for the restaurant in terms of testing and seeing what might work with a different means of distribution. But it's something we might say is not the most complex option either. The most complex option we have from the SWOT matrix would be launching new locations in the BRIC nations. And because this would entail growth, it's a corporate consideration. And because we would have to do lots of analysis determining which countries we would want to locate in, and the different standards or benchmarks we want to apply there, this is a highly complex alternative. Now, in this particular example, you see a diagonal from lower left to upper right. That doesn't necessarily occur when you plot this. It's just happened to occur in this example, so don't think that that's a natural phenomenon. The point here is you apply or use the SWOT, the SLSC matrix, to plot the different alternatives you have, so you can look and see how they might combine for the type of package or strategic package you want to develop. Keep in mind, your company might be able to employ multiple strategies. In this example, McDonald's could hypothetically pursue all 3 options. Of course, if you pursue lots of options, you add some complexity, something to keep in mind. We'll talk about that later. But the point being is that sometimes alternatives are mutually exclusive, and at other times they are not. Let's talk about a few issues in strategy formulation. Now, what about strategic change? Before you recommend a strategic change, you want to think through the issue of whether the benefits outweigh the costs. And I'm not trying to discourage you from suggesting or recommending a substantial change in strategy for your company, But you want to take a step back and think about the real costs. Cost-benefit analysis is really important. What about social responsibilities and ethics? Is the strategy compatible? So does your firm have certain positions in terms of social responsibility and ethics that may or may not be compatible with some of the strategies? This may not be a big issue in some of the areas, but it might pop up in others. For example, if one of your alternatives is to outsource, perhaps that is in conflict with a particular social responsibility or ethical position of the company. What effect does the change of strategy you're considering have on existing resources? Keep in mind, you can't just do everything. You can't institute new changes all over the board without affecting the current activities. A very interesting example of this is the notion of McDonald's adding new food products to its restaurants. You might say, well, this is a cost-free option, right? You just give consumers more choices. Well, it adds complexity to the process of putting sandwiches together and nuggets and all the other things that the preparation specialists do at McDonald's. The more different things they have to do, the more space is required, the more crowded things get, and the greater likelihood of mistakes. So there are costs associated with changing, with adding to the status quo, and you want to think through the effect that a change in strategy can have on the resources that are currently being applied. The final consideration here is how competitors will respond. Don't assume that competitors will just sit back while you make this change. So if McDonald's adds new products to the product line, what will competitors do? And sort of a simple example here with McDonald's, one that did not emerge from the SWOT matrix. But just imagine if McDonald's decided to promote its Big Mac as buy one, get one free. Or do you think that Burger King would sit back and watch, or do you think Burger King might introduce the Whopper as buy one, get one free as well? Just that basic strategic response illustrates that you can't just add up the sales from having a promotion on a Big Mac without thinking through how a competitor might respond. And you might have that same response at other competitors as well. So think through those issues before you recommend a particular strategy. Now we'll make a couple of comments here on blue ocean strategy. This is a very interesting alternative you might be thinking about as one of your options. Now, a growth strategy contingent on inventing or discovering a new industry or industry segment that creates new demand is referred to as a blue ocean strategy. So the whole idea here is you're actually moving in an area that is undeveloped. Now, the good thing about being in a blue ocean is that if you are successful, it's all yours. You're the first one there until, of course, somebody comes in, but you can have a chance to really profit and succeed for a long time, potentially. The problem, though, with a blue ocean strategy is you're the only company there. And if you're all alone in this ocean and your idea doesn't work out, well, sometimes you can incur serious losses. Now, examples of companies that have pursued blue ocean strategies successfully include Starbucks, eBay, Cirque du Soleil, in the coffee house, auction, and circus industries. And the point here is that these companies essentially did things unlike any other company had done at that point. Starbucks redefined the restaurant experience. eBay introduced with some other companies at the time, but eBay was predominant in introducing an online auction model, and Cirque du Soleil introduced a very interesting, unique circus experience. By the way, if you're not familiar with that company, Google it and see what you can learn. Go to YouTube and look at some videos of some of the things that occur with that circus. It's very interesting. It's something that's different from traditional circuits and circuses, and it's been that way for some time. Now, with a blue ocean strategy, success is not highly dependent on competitive responses because you don't have any competitors out there in the blue ocean, at least not yet. But the effective blue ocean strategies require a lot of research, creativity, and savvy. They're very difficult to put together. Just something to think about if one of your alternatives is putting you into a blue ocean. So let's close the chapter with a discussion of case analysis steps 20, 21, and 22. And here in 20, you use the SWOT matrix to develop alternatives. Now again, just a reminder, alternatives are different from opportunities. This is why you can't confuse them at the SWOT analysis level. Now, the specific combination of internal and external factors associated with each alternative should be identified. So don't just list your alternatives. You want to connect them with, let's say, strength 1 and strength 3 and opportunity 2 and threat number 4. Use the SLSC matrix to evaluate the alternatives that you've developed, evaluate the pros and cons of each one, and then select one or more for implementation. Now, keep in mind when you're doing this that the alternatives you identify need to be described in detail. In the example we just went through, we just provided one-liners for illustrations. But if you're talking about expanding a business or new product lines, be specific. What products are you talking about developing? Where do you want to go and why? So typically, each alternative should be a good, healthy paragraph explaining what you're thinking about. And when you go through the pros and cons, don't just list lots of phrases like higher costs or better marketing. It's difficult to figure out what you're talking about when you do that. Each pro and con should be a minimum of a sentence, and some of them would be much more detailed if you go into some cost issues. So be very thorough in terms of thinking through each option and providing the pros and cons. And at the end of the day, you're selecting one or more alternatives to implement, and you want to explain that rationale in detail. And that explanation needs to include why some alternatives were rejected. Now, you might suggest just one alternative. You might suggest a package of alternatives. It's possible you would reject all of them and pursue what we call a no change alternative. And that's okay, but if you do that, you still need to explain why you rendered that decision. It's not good enough to say the company is just doing well and we don't want to make any changes. Explain why the alternatives that you developed and considered were not good enough for implementation. So this concludes our audio commentary for this chapter.